I'm Julian. I play in a punk band from Canada called Inhalants, and I've spent about 4 years designing and prototyping this ridiculous instrument. I'm calling it the Lame Boy because it's powered by a Game Boy from the 90s. And when it's finished, it'll play music from the Game Boy, it'll control our live show lighting, it'll change my vocal effects on the fly, it's going to switch between different real instruments, and a bunch of other stuff that's going to make it essentially act as a robotic stage production crew because we can't afford to pay a guy to do that for us.
So today we're going to take this fictional object and make it a real one that hopefully doesn't suck too hard. It's the test assembly for the main brain of the whole machine, and it's called the Game Boy module because it has a Game Boy in it. The Game Boy module sends audio and MIDI information from the Game Boy to the rest of the machine. It lets me control it with this NES Advantage control stick from the 80s, and also lets me view the output from the Game Boy on an external HDMI display. So this module is responsible for basically the whole main functionality of the device. I've designed this faceplate and these two brackets to be able to assemble everything into a single component that can be easily removed and serviced. And in order to prototype these parts, I 3D printed them and laser cut them at my local library, which has this awesome makerspace. Yours might actually have one too, so you can go print your own weeb hentai figures for just a few bucks. Eventually, the faceplate's going to be made of aluminum, but while I'm test fitting everything, this laser cut piece of draft board cost me $4, so it's a great material for these prototypes, and I can modify it by hand if I need to, just using a drill. The assembly goes like this. First, you take the faceplate and then attach the 3D printed bracket. Real easy. Then you attach the front half of a Game Boy to the other side. The virgin nerds among you might notice I'm using a Game Boy Color motherboard, but I'm using an original Game Boy shell for the front. This is because the Game Boy Color motherboard has a way faster processor, so I can write more complicated music, and of course it outputs a color image, which is going to look better on the display, but the actual aesthetics of the original Game Boy are way cooler. So as much as I want everything to be functional and not just aesthetic, the front half of this Game Boy won't actually do anything because the next item that goes on here is a little circuit board called the Consolizer. It comes from an awesome little company called Gamebox Systems, and it translates the video signal from the Game Boy motherboard into an upscaled HDMI signal that can be used with a standard display, which is pretty amazing. It also interprets the inputs from the control stick and lets me control the Game Boy externally. So that screws on right here. And then you attach the Game Boy motherboard on top of it. The Game Boy motherboard has a few mods of its own. One is to bypass the shitty internal headphone amplifier, so I'm getting more of a direct signal from the sound chip. It also filters some general system noise and increases the bass response of the Game Boy Color. The audio signal from this will eventually come out of these 3 jacks on the faceplate and go to the patch bay from there. 2 of the jacks are for audio and 1 of them is for the MIDI data that I mentioned. In order to send the MIDI data, I have to send the link cable data through this little Arduino called an Arduino Boy that translates the output from the Game Boy into the MIDI programming standard. If you don't understand what MIDI does, it's just a standard for sending digital musical instructions. So it connects to other devices and lets me play notes, sync tempos, or change parameters of those devices based on the instructions programmed in the Game Boy. It also allows the Game Boy to be instructed by other things, so I can keep the Game Boy in time. So I made this little 3D printed bracket to store that. Look how fucking sweet this snap fit is. And that's everything that attaches to the bracket. So now that everything is securely mounted, we can start attaching the audio jacks. Everything that's going to go to the PA first passes through this simple noise gate circuit here. Despite the noise filtering mod I mentioned earlier, the Game Boy still emits some quiet passive noise when it's not playing anything, and that can be annoying on stage through the PA. So this noise gate is harvested from a cheap Donner micro pedal and just has a knob to control the gate threshold and a switch which controls the ratio. It's super simple and it fits really nicely here, and it works exactly for what I need, which is just a very, very low threshold noise gate. Channel 2 passes through a noise gate as well, but it uses the same noise gate that's on my bass pedal board because Channel 2 is exclusively for synth bass, so that saves me having an extra piece of hardware. One thing you might notice is that the MIDI output jack is the same as the audio jacks. For those of you who are familiar with a standard MIDI jack, you might be surprised to know that even though it has 5 pins, only 3 of them are used. So
I can use the same kind of cable, a tip ring sleeve. I can use that to connect all of the audio devices and all of the MIDI devices. So I can just use a single cable in the patch bay. That means mono audio, stereo audio, and MIDI can all use the same connection type, which is going to keep everything uniform and easy to replace because those cables are available. So now that we have this prototype assembled, I just want to test everything. Here's how it works with the control stick. The Consolizer has really good scaling options to make it work for whatever display you're using, and it's possible to control with either a Super Nintendo controller or a Nintendo controller. The guys at Gamebox did a great job with it, and it saved me a ton of work on designing my own interface or, like an Arduino or something. I don't know how to program. The only downside is that this Consolizer doesn't save your menu settings when it's turned off. So if I don't find a way around that, I'm going to have to change these settings every time it turns on, which is kind of going to kill the all-in-oneness of it. Either way, this is a pretty monumental achievement because for the first time since we started building this stupid project, I actually have the main idea together working in reality. So I just have to make sure that these connections are strong and that there's no errors that come up. But as it stands, the concept and the signal path of controlling it with the control stick, having the Game Boy be the video output to the screen is all possible, and it all works right now in front of me. So that's awesome. I've been working on this for so long. It's pretty stressful putting things together because it seems like it's never going to end, but it feels like I'm climbing the mountain for sure. So from here on out, because I have access to the 3D printer and laser cutter, most episodes are going to be about building instead of designing. And I think we're about half done with this project. I'm going to be working hard on it over the next few months, but we also have recording time booked, so I'll see if I can multitask that. If I can get it done, maybe I can get my life back and work on some other impossible project, like actually playing music and playing shows and writing and whatever. I also took a vector graphic from the design and made a shirt out of it that you can buy on our online store if you want. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching and buying an Inhalants t-shirt, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and our music is all in the description. So love you.